Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Praxis Peace Ideas Festival. This is our last program in the festival, so we are happy for all of you who are with us today. I think you're going to hear something quite astonishing, as Andrew always is one of our most interesting speakers. So I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we do have Andrew KIMBRELL, and I want to just say a few things about him before we begin. He wanted to present some new material today before the discussion. So many of you may or may not know that in 2008, The Guardian named Andrew KIMBRELL one of 50 people in the world, quote, most likely to save the earth, unquote. He was also named one of the 100 leading visionaries in the world by the Utne Reader. He's a public interest attorney, author, and advocate for sustainable agriculture. He is the founder and executive director of the Center for Food Safety in Washington, D.C., and the International Center for Technology Assessment. He is also the co-founder of Foundation Earth and the president of the Board of Humane Farm Animal Care. So he served as a policy director at the Foundation for Economic Trends for 8 years. He has sued Monsanto, which we all applaud, and he has actively opposed GMOs in our food supply. So he's been a very active advocate for us and for people and for animals. So welcome, Andrew. We're happy to have you with us today.
Georgia, wonderful to be with you and Praxis folks again. And I just want to say congratulations to you for bringing all these amazing people together again and bringing all this and bring this into the world. I'm very, very appreciative. You have extraordinary breadth of knowledge and understanding that lets you bring all of this. You're sort of the glue that keeps all of this together. And I've seen this for many years. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate that personally.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that you're a fabulous pianist.
Well,
I could have become a concert pianist.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about music before it's all over today. I hope at least one question on music.
Okay.
Maybe a little to do with what Jeremy Lent was talking about as far as patterns. Maybe we can get that a little bit later. I do want to say it is true that the Utne Reader many years ago called me one of the 100 world's leading visionaries. And as part of that, they held sort of a conference at Town Hall, a little meeting, and each visionary was asked to get up and speak in front of the public for 5 minutes. I'm not sure how much vision you can get done in 5 minutes, but we all got up there, and I was the fifth one. And I noticed that the four that preceded me all had very thick lenses, as I do, glasses. And so it occurred to me that it's possible that to be a visionary, you really can't see at all. So maybe everyone should, just take everything I'm saying today with a grain of salt as far as the non-seeing visionary. But I did want to add something. It was such a great discussion we had several months ago, and the questions were so marvelous, and it was just a wonderful to be part of that. But there was a couple of things that I think might further elucidate some of the issues that we were talking about. And so I thought I might go on for a little bit here, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can have a discussion about the prior conversation and whatever I'm going to bring up today. And but as a brief review, for those of you who either did not hear the first presentation or have heard many brilliant things since then and don't quite remember it, I was talking about fundamentally paradigm shifts that will get us towards an ecological society. And there were 6 we really covered. The first, which is also a huge consciousness shift, is this idea of going from nationalism to earth citizenship and bioregionalism, right? We're never going to get to an ecological society if we continue the current pattern of hyper-nationalism, which ends up in kind of international Darwinism, where nations are competing with each other for the last oil, for the last water, the last resources of the earth. If that's how this is going to proceed, there's zero hope. And the nation state has been a catastrophe for quite a while now. We don't need to talk about World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the possible annihilation of the entire planet in nationalistic struggles. And of course, today we're seeing an exacerbation of that to the absolutely hyper-nationalism, not just here, but we know that in Orban in Hungary and in Poland and throughout Europe and in India and Brazil, you name it. we're seeing this hyper-nationalism coming. This is catastrophic if we're trying to move towards an ecological society. So that's the big paradigm shift. We need to get away from this nationalism and this hyper-nationalism and into the idea of Earth citizenship, loyalty to the planet, and then bioregionalism, because the bioregions are cooperative. They exist together in synchronicity and with mutualities and you name it, right? So the nation state is completely alienated from ecological reality. The bioregions are embedded in it. So Earth citizenship and the overall thing, bioregionalism, and the diminishing of the nation state. That's just a major paradigm shift that at least we have to start thinking about and thinking of forms of governance, bioregional forms of governance within the concept of Earth citizenship and Earth advocacy. So that's sort of absolutely critical paradigm shift. The second is, which we talked about, is this delusion of extraction, the age of extraction, where somehow we thought we could extract elements of nature faster than they could be regenerated. And that, of course, is the culture of death, the culture of extinction. So we have to move away, end of the age of extraction, which is ending anyway, because we're exhausting resources at that rate, whether it be water, fossil fuels, you name it. And remember that sometimes we talk about renewable and non-renewable resources. It's really a false distinction, because if you take so-called renewable resources, like the passenger pigeon, for example, and you exploit it to a certain extent, it quickly becomes a non-renewable resource and goes extinct. So, extinction doesn't just happen with so-called non-renewable resources. We turn renewable resources, I hate that word, renewable elements of nature, into non-renewables and they become extinct. So we then go from the age of extraction to the age of regeneration, where the capacity of nature to regenerate itself is how society organizes itself, right? So from nation state, nationalism to world citizenship, that's one big paradigm shift. From the extraction, industrial extraction, to regeneration. The next one we talked about is this idea of elimination or extermination, the idea that we can exterminate those aspects of nature that don't suit the industrial system. We talked about pesticides, we talked about antibiotics. The idea is to try and get rid of those things because they don't fit with the industrial, medical, or agricultural system. That is not working. Even small scale adaptation, evolution, we are seeing, weeds resisting herbicides, insects resisting insecticides. We're seeing antibiotics, bacteria now that we cannot kill with any known antibiotic. We're seeing fungal infections in humans that cannot be addressed with any fungicide because nature's adapted. So that war against nature is a war against ourselves. So from eradication to what we see in probiotics, we see in ecological agriculture, to biodiversity and participation, right? We have to go from earth-centered education to ecological education. My great mentor and friend, Thomas Berry, would never stop talking about this in a great way, that until we get, and I think a wonderful person mentioned it in the Q&A last time, until we're able to really bring this kind of education to very young children and in a participatory way, not merely in a science way, a participatory way, where that, that nature deficit disorder we're seeing in children because of some of the digital addiction we're seeing has to be overcome, because this has to be brought up in children in a very new way, seeing the history there and seeing the history of our pattern of exploitation of the earth too. Then I think we need to move, another major paradigm shift has to be from ecological, from industrial consciousness to ecological consciousness, and the industrial worldview into ecological consciousness. And that's something I do want to talk about right now. But I want to do that within the context of reminding us that in these big paradigm shifts that we need to get through. And by the way, I would add one more to that, which is from the market economy to ecological economics, or if we want to reverse and turn ecology into the noun and economics into the adjective, which might be more apt, you could call it economic ecology. So that's another paradigm shift. So 6 paradigm shifts altogether that are the ones I'm working with right now. And then the 4 blocks to that, we mentioned, and of course, as I mentioned, David is the expert on this, corporate power, right? Those corporations are extracting those fossil fuels. They're making those pesticides that cause the elimination of biodiversity and this great extinction crisis that we're in, right? And so they profit by the market economy, by the idea that somehow, nature can be treated in a supply and demand manner. So Corporate power is sitting right there is a major problem. Another major problem is what I call panacea technologies. And that's the idea that geoengineering, artificial intelligence, robotics, genetic engineering are going to save us. Sure, technology got us into all this mess, but guess what? Technology is going to save us. I'll talk about that a little bit. The third one is the military surveillance complex, right? These power of military surveillance. If we become powerful and there's a breakdown in society, that is a tremendous problem. And the fourth I mentioned was digital addiction, this sort of technological cocooning that we're seeing, especially with young people. You only defend that which you love. If kids are, if we can trust some of these studies, and the average kid now spending 7 hours in front of their machines and watching in these screens and only about 7 minutes in the natural world, that dooms any progress towards an ecological society, because you will defend that which you love. Go out and, people ask me, what should I do to protect the earth? I go out and fall in love with something. Fall in love with the tree, fall in love with the stream, fall in love with the butterfly, fall in love with the bee, fall in love with the flower. But for God's sakes, fall in love. Because if you do, just like any of us, we defend those things we love. We defend them fiercely. And so fall in love, and then the rest will take care of itself. I've been an environmental lawyer for 35 years. And worked with some of the best environmentalists and environmental lawyers. And I have never met a single one of them that is doing this work because they want to see more efficient use of so-called natural resources. Not one. Never met one. Every one of the people I know, they're in it because they fall in love. They're defending rivers or streams or mountains or animals, soil, plants, all those things they find beautiful, and often they fall in love, as many of us have, many more times than once. So those are the 6 big paradigm shifts and the 4 major, and I'm sure everybody can come up with more, 4 major blocks in there. But there's one I want to get into that is a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more difficult. And I came to this about 30 years ago, actually 1990. And I was down in Florida, and I was litigating to halt the flight of the shuttle Discovery. I don't know how many people remember Discovery, but Discovery was a couple of years after the disaster. And Discovery was very exciting for people because it carried a probe with it, mythologically named Ulysses. So then this probe was going to probe various planets. And the controversy was that the probe was nuclear powered. So this shuttle was going to go up with a nuclear power pack. If it exploded, as the one prior to it had, that would spread that radiation all the way through the southern United States and beyond. So, and not enough research had been done. So I litigated to halt it. They had not done any environmental review. They had complied with the National Environmental Policy Act. And I had an old judge, because it was a preliminary injunction. Actually, it was a temporary restraining order. And it was Monday before the launch. And the judge got more and more impatient with me, big nasty guy. And finally he said, well, I'm going to let it go off, and because I want to get home and watch Monday Night Football. So the next morning I was going to leave before, because the case blew up, and I said, no, I lost the case. I'm going to watch it. So I sat there, and in Cape Canaveral, I guess, and off it went. And, this huge roar and this arc, and there was many, many people in the safe place we were watching. And I looked at their faces, and these upturned faces, and many of them were crying. And it suddenly reminded me of a Albrecht Dürer etching I have in the foyer of my home, the Ascension of Christ, which shows just the feet of Christ in a big cloud around those feet, and the upturned faces of the apostles as they see the ascending Christ. And it was just remarkable. And I actually got a picture of one and got the other, and I compared them, and it was just remarkable. And something clicked to me. I said, there's something going on here. This isn't just about science and technology and everything, industrialism. There's a stronger valence going on. But it took me a while to really think about it. And a few years later, I got my degree, my graduate degree in psychology, and did a pretty deep study of Eric Fromm, whom I love, and C.G. Jung, who also I love. And they both came up with this idea that there is a religious function which is natural to the human, right? So what Fromm said is that, throughout society, all societies, we have seen this religious function. So it's really not a matter of whether there is going to be a religion or not. It's a matter of what that religion is going to be. And Jung came up with a similar idea, with this idea of the religious or transcendent function, which again says this is a natural function. You can't get rid of it through Enlightenment thinking. You're going to have a religion in one way or other. Maybe it's going to be an ism, communism or capitalism. Maybe it's going to be money. Maybe it's going to be some other aspect. You will believe. When you stop believing in God, it doesn't mean you stop believing. It means you'll then maybe believe in almost anything that comes around. So I said, what if this is true? If it is true, then we've got about 41% of our population in the United States that says they are reborn Christian or evangelical, 41%, right? And that's opposed by the Enlightenment progressives, many people who are agnostics or atheists who see this as a great fight between the superstitions of these religions and modern scientific reality. And we see a big wave in this right now with Pinker and a number of these sort of new atheist thinkers. Sam Harris comes to mind, and others. And just talking about this terrible superstition that we have to get rid of through science. And it occurred to me that there may be a religious valence in that, but if there is a religious valence to industrial society, even industrial capitalism, what would that be? And I thought, well, since industrial capitalism, and this all grew up in a Judeo-Christian culture, maybe it's a reflection somehow of the Judeo-Christian culture. Well, what would that mean? So I began to say, well, what would be the one thing that everyone has, if legare, which is the Latin root of religion, that which binds, what actually binds our society? What are those elements that bind it? And I'm not the first to suggest that the religion behind it is religion of progress, linear progress. The idea that linear progress, that we are through the Enlightenment until now, we're getting better and better in every way, in a linear way, towards sort of a heaven on earth where we will abolish disease, where we will create a perfect societies. And we have to remember this word progress, which just means stepping forward, right, from its Latin root, was originally spiritual, right? Pilgrim's Progress. Progress was used quite often by our founders, but they meant progress in the enfranchisement and the rights of individuals. It wasn't really till about the end of World War I where progress became more and more associated with technological advancement and especially technological control over the natural world. And it reflected a kind of a disappointment in the prior views of progress in European culture. The spiritual progress and the progress of man through rights, through our various revolutions, they didn't stop World War I, which was seen correctly as a catastrophe. If they couldn't do that, then what was real progress? And progress became identified with technological advancement. And it became something that everyone was united by. Now, a lot of us who are of a certain age, we remember, advertisements like progress is our middle name, and better living through chemistry. And we remember the Jetsons, which was all these future visions we were raised to talk about, non-ecological education, all these things that we were raised with. This was going to be the future of the world. And everybody was going to eat pills, and somehow they'd be drinking an orange kind of fluid, which we thought was probably Tang, because that was the drink of the astronauts. And so this was the future vision, that we were given. And so it occurred to me that if progress is the religion, right, if it is the equivalent of, let's say, Christianity, what are the bases of progress? How is progress being made? And it occurred to me that it breaks down into a trinity, a triune, really, because in the Christian tradition, it's not really a trinity of God, it's triune, it's 3 in 1, that they're totally interrelated. And I began to discover that, think about it, at least explore the idea that we have a triune, which is behind the religion of progress. And that triune is science, technology, and the market. And science is, and now if you need to think of science, technology, and the market, you have to think of them as hypostatas. In other words, capital S science, capital T technology, capital M market, right? I'm not saying that markets in various societies aren't fine, that science isn't fine, that certain kinds of technology, I happen to be, as you know, prejudiced towards the piano. These are good, but the idea that science as a personage, science tells us that we fall in love because of genetics. Science tells us that the world began with a big bang or little bangs or whatever. You know, today's technology is allowing us, capital T. The market informs all decisions, capital M. So they're people. They've been personified. They've been projected into actually godlike individuals, and they speak ex cathedra, right? So let's take a closer look at that. Is this just fanciful? Letting my Blakean imagination go too far? Maybe. But if we think about it, capital S science claims ultimately omniscience. Right? There's even essays saying, what are we going to do when science finds out about everything? The underlying assumption is that science is going to tell us everything, why we fall in love, why we love music, what's going on in nature. It will tell us everything, right? It's omniscient, right? And you just bow your head. And of course, there's a priesthood of scientists. There's the scientific method, which is viewed the only way towards truth, the only way, dependable way towards truth. You may say, that birds sing because they're celebrating themselves. No, that's not why birds sing. Birds sing, they'll tell you why, because it's survival, Darwin, whatever, right? So, and it's reductionist. As Scott Buchanan said, science separated out the quantitative from the qualitative. I mean, all those Enlightenment thinkers that you can think about, Galileo, Newton, they were all mathematicians. If you couldn't mathematize it, it wasn't real. So, for example, it was discovered long before Newton that if you dropped an apple, it would come down to the earth. No one thought it was going to just stay in the middle of, it was going to bop you on the head if you were under the tree, right? But that was considered part of a greater law of attraction. They would see this, right? Personal attraction, for example, the magnetic attraction. They saw the whole world of attraction. What Newton did is he separated that out from the larger qualitative and quantitative idea of attraction. He named it gravity and mathematized it so it became true. This is what Buchanan called a world splitter, splitting a world. So in this sense, science created a whole new world, a world devoid of qualities and only true insofar as it could be understood as quantities. Right? If I tell you that my daughter is spiritual and that she's very, very creative and that her smile could light up a room, the scientists will say, that's very nice. That's your subjective view of your daughter. But meanwhile, she's 5'7", she weighs 124 pounds, whatever. This is the objection. She's this much potassium. She's short on vitamin D. So science has created a whole world. And it is created in a language that is indecipherable to almost everyone. Anybody here who's tried to read complex biological material, context, physics, it's not for the average person. So very much like the priests of before, it stands ex cathedra, and everyone says, well, I don't understand, so it must be true, right? So science is omniscient, but most people don't understand it. So science needed to be incarnated into something that was salvific for humans, like Christ to God. And that is technology. Technology is the son of science. Technology is what makes science real to us, right? In technology, we view technology as essentially salvific, right? If we want to be cured of a disease, it's technology that's going to do it. And they often speak of it in biblical terms. I copied this down once because I was at, let's see if I can find it. I copied this down a few years ago because we were litigating to try and regulate some of this new nanotechnology. And I heard Philip Bond, who was the Undersecretary of Commerce, not normally somebody you'd think of as somebody who'd be tempted by religious language, but here's what he said about nanotechnology. And I noted in my notes here that his voice was rising. On a human level, nanotechnology's potential rises to near biblical proportions. It is not inconceivable that these technologies could achieve the truly miraculous, enabling the blind to see, the lame to walk, and the deaf to hear, curing AIDS, cancer, diabetes, and other afflictions, ending hunger, and even supplementing the power of our minds, enabling us to think great thoughts, create new knowledge, gain great new insights. So this is the Undersecretary of Commerce talking. This isn't not an evangelical about nanotechnology. And of course, nanotechnology claims eventually and to be omnipotent, right? So science is omniscient. Technology can do it, can blow up the world, but it can do maybe do all the things that Undersecretary Bond says it can do. Right? So it's salvific, and like a lot of things in religion, like Yahweh himself, it both is our salvation, but it could also be our doom. Technology has that awesome power. And it, as I mentioned in my prior talk, it determines a lot of our current life. It legislates our life much more than any legislation does. But, you know, with tech, and by the way, its gospel is the gospel of efficiency, right? Maximum output, right? Minimum effort, minimum time. And I think I want to take just a moment to say, think how cold both those are. Think how cold the idea of separating all the qualitative aspects of nature and ourselves and human nature from the quantitative, and how cold it is, that doctrine of efficiency. You know, if I were to say I have two children, two grown children now, but I've said when they were younger, I treated them efficiently, getting, you know, maximum good grades for minimum attention in minimum time spent with them. What kind of a father am I? Right? I love dogs, and dogs are the least efficient creatures on earth. You know, my dogs do no work at all. They eat a whole bunch. I lavish affection on them, and they'll occasionally eat a baseball glove or pee on the rug. But you know, and most of our friendships were not based on efficiency, right? Yeah. So it's very cold. Goes back to my piece on cold evil. So the technology is great, but how do we spread the gospel of science and technology? How is the gospel spread? The gospel spread through the market, right? The market has its own priests. We've got the scientists, we've got the engineers, and we have the economists, the dismal scientists, right? Our entire society is run by economists. Their data, their numbers, unemployment, GDP, those numbers, stock market, that runs society. There's at least 5 24-hour cable networks that do nothing but this, right? Harvey Cox wrote actually a book following an article called "The Market is God." He's the theologian, Harvey Cox. So he's sort of in on this, so he didn't talk about science or technology. So the market is omnipresent. So the three characteristics of God are omniscience, omnipotent, and omnipresent. Those are the three. And the market is that. It has its own dogma of supply and demand, which we talked about. We talked about in our last. It has its own dogma of competition. And if you're a heretic to it or the other two, you will not do very well in academia. You will not do very well in this society, right? My old friend Jeremy Rifkin wrote a book called "The Declaration of a Heretic" 35 or 40 years ago. Pretty good. Very short book, but pretty good. So, and by the way, think about this whole idea of competition being at the essence of the market. Again, how cold is that? What if I had my two kids, my daughter Kailani and my son Nicholas, and one came home with a C or B report card, they came home with an A. And I said, "Hey, Nick, you know, you got the C. You are the weakest link. Now you're gone. Bye-bye." You know, and this is what I always thought was curious about NAFTA and the other trade agreements, when Clinton and these people would say, "This is great. We are now going to be successful and defeat all these other countries." And I said, "Really? So while we get more and more wealthy, and that's good that they're going to get poorer and poorer and poorer. We're going to win that race." Really? Because with competition, there's always a loser. But the problem is that when you're locked into the market idea of competition, you keep having to fight it, right? Being a loser doesn't mean you get out of the system. It means you have to keep fighting to try and compete in the system. So it's Roland May pointed that out, the great psychologist, and it's a terrible syndrome, and it's spiritually devastating. And the market, by doing that, turns everybody into a commodity, because if everything has to be run by supply and demand, as we mentioned last time, as Polanyi points out, then as Eric Fromm, by the way, points out as well, then we're all commodities. We're not different than the purses on the shelf or the food. Some of us get picked, some of us don't, right? And we suffer from that enormously psychologically, from being commodities, from the bedroom to the boardroom. It's it's again incredibly cold, a cold ethic. So it occurred to me that there isn't really a war going on between scientific enlightenment and superstitious religion. It's rather that we have a compensatory ersatz Christianity, with progress being the eschatological heaven, except a heaven on earth, immanentizing the eschaton, is what Vogelin called it, progress. But it's the same idea of linear progress, going to heaven. Underneath that, we've got this trinity of science, technology, and the market, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, market being the Holy Spirit, that visits us every day. I think most people are much more excited to go to the mall than they are to go to church. And that this is really a compensatory religion to Christianity, which was so otherworldly, so interested in the future life, that it ignored the material life. And so a compensatory Christianity came in, completely sort of stood Christianity on its head and into this material civil religion, very cold civil religion, that is the fundamental beliefs, the fundamental ethic, the fundamental glue of the industrial consciousness. So if we are going to move, as one of my paradigms says, from industrial consciousness to ecological consciousness, we're going to have to recognize that we're not just dealing with facts, rational thinking. We're dealing with a deeply, deeply unconsciously held religious valence. That's what we're going up against. When I'm debating somebody on genetic engineering, we're not having a rational debate about what genetic engineering has brought us, which is almost nothing, as we all know. But rather, I'm debating a religious fanatic, somebody who has to believe in that, because if he doesn't, he doesn't know what else to believe in, right? That technology has to be salvific, because if he doesn't believe in that, what is he going to believe in? Science has to bring us the truth. It has to be the only way to get the truth. Because if I don't believe that, what will I believe in? What, poetry is going to give me the truth? Beethoven is going to give me the truth? No. This is how we're going to get, the only way to get to the truth. By the way, Freud went along with that. And of course, the market dominates society. So this is what we're dealing with. And it's another block. It's another serious, in my view. I realize this may seem fanciful to some, but I've become convinced that it's really true. This secular trinity, this sort of, progress is religion with its secular trinity. And again, just try, everybody on this call is a heretic. So I don't need to tell anybody on this call, maybe another audience, but no, on this call, we're all heretics. And we know the price you pay for that. Oh my God. And I don't call people who are writing in science today science journalists. I call them science writers, because they're not really journalists. They're not trying to expose, they're actually trying to advertise capital S science as the only way to the truth. A lot of this talk we're having right now about vaccines, about this stuff, and Fauci just said, I represent science. If you oppose what I'm saying, you are opposing science, capital S science, right? Now, whether we agree with what Fauci's been saying or not, no. That's literally saying God's on my side. If you're not on my side, you're against God, capital S science, right? So it's not trivial to realize that there is this vehemence. And, as horrible as it was quite often that the Christian missionaries would go into these, what we call, vernacular societies and try and get rid of their gods and put in the Trinitarian gods in their place, at least they knew what they were doing. If what I'm saying is true, huge values, and those values include, as I was saying, empathy, qualitative aspects of nature and human nature, and non-market value, so non-commodification. Those are just, they're viewed as heresies. And again, we need I think we need to address that as a major paradigm shift. And there's one other aspect to it. And Jung points this out. Always brilliant, Jung, or almost always, which is that in all triune or Trinitarian, and including the Egyptian, by the way, in some Hindu traditions, there's always a fourth. There's always a fourth. There's something that turns that triangle into a rectangle. And we know it well in the Christian tradition, right? What is the fourth? There's the Father, there's the Son, there's the Holy Spirit. And what's the fourth? It's always dark. It's always considered evil. And the fourth is Satan. And this is true in all of the Trinity religions that we've been able to find. There's always the dark fourth. So the question is, going along with my hypothesis here, if we got the Father, science, the Son, technology, the Holy Spirit, the market that visits us every day through advertisements and all the others, you guys can fill all that in, as well as I do. What's the fourth? What's the dark fourth? Could be more than one. For a while, I thought the fourth was the older Christianity, not the ersatz, Christianity that I've been describing. But sort of true, but no. And then for a while, I thought, maybe, the fourth would be a sort of humanist kind of psychology. But I realized, no, I think the fourth is the limits of nature. I think this entire religion of progress, science, technology, and market, is designed to overcome, not just overcome the limits of nature, but through things like meta, right? META now, actually to create a whole new non-nature that substitutes for it. There's a deep fury, if you will, anger at the limits of nature. And the idea is to usurp it. And to do that, you have to be cold, because you're usurping human nature and the beauty of the natural world. And it's an evangelical drive. So when I think of evangelical, I don't just think of the evangelicals over here, the reborns. I think of the evangelicals over here. They're just as fanatic. They will ostracize you just as quickly. They are just as non-nuanced, and they are true believers. So it changes the whole context of what we're dealing with as we look to recontextualize the limits of nature as critical to meaning, to our meaning, and the meaning of everything that we are. Not the enemy, but actually the context for our own meaning. I'm not crazy about the idea of death. I think Woody Allen said, I don't mind death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. Which is, and if you want to defeat death, the only way you can do that is to defeat life, which is not something that I would suggest is a good idea. So, so I wanted to get a little deeper into that. It explains that idea of panacea technologies that I was talking about before. It's not just that they're manipulating, front page stories in the New York Times or CNN or other media sources on, nanotechnology, geoengineering, artificial intelligence. They are actually unconsciously continuing to bolster up its idea as salvific. It will, and in the citadel of expertise and where the wasteland ends, Ted Rozak wrote about this, 35, 40 years ago. He said, we always will try and resolve technological questions through new technology, right? He didn't go further and say it's because it's a belief system, or that, that the market is a belief system, but they are. Anyway, I wanted to add that to our prior discussion of blocks of moving towards what we have to move towards, an ecological society. If not only we survive, but if we don't take much of the natural world with us. Georgia, people often say to me, what, we're viruses. So the earth will be better off if we just go, humans go. Well, first of all, that'd be incredibly tragic because I think there's so much beauty and greatness in the human as well as these shadows. But the other thing is, that's not how it's going to happen. Whether it's nuclear weapons or turning this planet into Venus, I've got bad news. When the human goes, the human's taking the rest of the natural world, or most of it, with us, except maybe a few roaches. So, if we're Venus, forget it, folks. And if we have a nuclear winter, forget it. So there's no great comfort. We don't have any choice to say, well, let's just do one huge immolation of the human. That's not how it's going to work. So, we're not just fighting for our own survival here. We're fighting for the survival of the entire Earth community. And as I said before, this multidimensional being, because even Earth system science, which is it's a less edifying name than the Gaia hypothesis. I love that Gaia. Earth system science is pretty reductionist, but even they are finding, hey, the Earth is a multidimensional superorganism that we have all co-evolved together. From the bacteria, all living things, and the abiotic community. It's a living superorganism. And it doesn't mean it has to have consciousness. Some people say it does, some people doesn't. But we recognize that when we're asleep or we're unconscious, we have no idea how all those systems are keeping us alive, keeping our temperature, keeping all those things, that dynamic homeostasis that we rely on. And even right now, as I talk to you, I am blissfully unconscious of 99% of what's happening in my body that's allowing me to be here and say these words. So the Earth is just the same. It's a superorganism, just like we are, with our trillions of viruses, literally, and bacteria, all the things that are going on, all these systems that are working in us. We're just a mini Earth with all of its systems, and it's the biosphere and the hydrosphere and the atmosphere, and you name all those things working together. So that is the creative. And again, either a secular miracle or a sacred mystery, but is by embracing that and embracing those limits is at least my antidote to the religion of progress and the secular or cold trinity.
Well, this has given us so much to think about, and I've scribbled a bunch of questions, and I'm sure other people have many as well. Just want to make some comments because I also watched the program that you did for us earlier this year, last night, to just kind of remind myself. And I think this idea that you're bringing up, that we have a sense of needing some kind of a religious structure in our lives is very, very interesting, because many agnostics and atheists want to say, oh, that doesn't exist, we don't need it. But then we look at Dawkins, and he is a fundamentalist with his beliefs of the selfish gene or whatever. So he's still buying into a religion and doesn't recognize it. But one thing you brought up, and I didn't hear it this time, but I heard it underneath of what you were saying, and I think it's really important, is you said that religion, and I think this is all kinds of religion, whether it's the science, technology religion, or the actual religions that we're used to traditionally, is that their ethics have not evolved. And I think that was such a critical point that I'd like you to talk about. How would that look if the ethics evolved? What's that look like to you? And then I'll open it up to people.
Yeah, well, and behind that, Henri Bergson wrote a whole book about static and dynamic religions. Wonderful book. What happens is when the ethics of a religion do not evolve, the religion becomes static. And we're seeing that in all the monotheistic religions right now. They're losing support. And what happens, unfortunately, in our own lives, sometimes even our relationships, when we know they're threatened and probably going, we cling on the hardest quite often. So you're seeing, it's not that people begin to lose. No, what happens is the people, when they see that faith going, they cling on to it harder and harder and harder, and with less and less flexibility, less nuance, and more dogmatism. And we're seeing that both at the nation state, we're seeing that in religions. And even the religion of progress is no longer very dynamic. If you speak to the kids, millennials, my kids' age, they're not as bought into it as some of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s were. And there's good reason for that. They, with climate crisis, what they're seeing with greater and greater inequality, they're saying, hey, I may not, and again, but the market is God, I may not make as much money or be as successful as my parents were, right? Most kids believe that right now. So, it's not that the four horsemen of the apocalypse are all riding right now, but they're saddling up when you think of these threats and these continued threats. And the ethics of the old religions, of the monotheistic religion, let's just stick with Christianity, something I know best, though I've studied the others a bit, but Christianity is what I know best, is that ethic was based in a idea of satanic evil. That ethic was based on what I would call hot evil. The idea that don't be greedy. Look at the 10 Commandments. Don't be murdering. Don't be adulterous. Don't be lustful. Don't be slothful. Don't, all of these sins that are these aspects of human nature, right? And if you go to a pulpit today, if that's what you'll hear. That's what you'll hear in the synagogue and the mosque, is this, and that ethic hasn't developed to take in this cold religion, has not taken in the challenges of technology, has not taken in a critique of the market. I mean, the current Pope has, and a few others, but not in general. As a matter of fact, much of Christianity in the United States holds the market to be equally sacred dogma as they do to their evangelical beliefs, right? Bizarrely enough, since it's obviously not in the New Testament. So that failure to understand that so much of the evil that we see in the world, whether it be the nuclear holocaust, or we see the burning of fossil fuels, the killing of this superorganism, the Earth, is just not dealt with. That ethic hasn't developed. It reminds me a little bit of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I don't know how many folks have read that or read it recently. There's two kinds of evil in that book. One is the Belgian imperialists who are exploiting these, and as the protagonist in the first person narrative of the book, he goes in there and he sees all these people dying, and that's because the Belgians don't even view them as human. But it's all bureaucratic. They're not evil. They're not stabbing anybody. They're not screaming and howling. And of course, when he finally Kurtz is hot evil. He's in the jungle. He's doing terrible things. He's beheading people. He's gone into this hot evil. But if you read it carefully, Conrad makes it pretty clear that of the two, Kurtz is the more interesting, but not the most evil. It's that cold evil that's destroying the whole country through using these people, exploiting their work in the mines. That's the real evil. So Conrad got it, the cold evil, that when the IMF does structural adjustment, as I mentioned in my prior talk, that because of the need to pay back these loans, which are often for very high capitalized projects, dams, nuclear power plants, they cut all these programs. As I mentioned, the IPS said that they said 17,000 kids, at a minimum that they've been able to think are killed, right, on a monthly basis. Imagine anybody, that's cold evil. Cold evil. I mean, nobody's saying, hey, I just love, using coal powered plants because we're killing the planet. No, but the cold evil is that's what they're doing. That's the terroricide that's happening. It's happening through greed, through the market. It's happening through all those things. So there's a failure, a profound failure in the traditional religions to be dynamic. And I would, in really taking in the real evils of our time and stop obsessing on sex, on these other sins, and start really dealing with the great
sins,
crimes of our time. And then as far as the ethics of the religion of progress, the only ethic there is that, as I said, how can we more and more quickly master the natural world? How we can more and more quickly utilize the natural world and expropriate it to create commodities using our technology, using our scientific know-how for the good of so-called good of humanity. And the ethics are, what ethic is there in the scientific method? What ethic is there in the doctrine of efficiency? What ethic is there in the doctrine of supply and demand or in competition? They themselves are unethical. It's unethical to turn the world into commodities. So yeah, there's a lacuna here, isn't there, Georgia? The real ethic that we have to deal with here is not being embodied sufficiently in a manner that is inspiring enough to bring in its own religious valence.
I'll have to take you to Mondragon, Andrew.
Yes, well,
there's where the ethic is alive and very helpful toward humanity and the planet. And they
I
get
would be, I would be, I think it's also, if anybody on the call is really interested in how could Christianity become more dynamic.
I'm gonna, you know what, Andrew, I want to get other people's questions.
Oh, sure.
in.
Please
Yeah,
go
so
on.
let me go to Jonathan next. Jonathan?
Yeah, hi, Andy. How you doing?
Hanging in
Good
there.
to see you.
Ambulatory and semi-coherent, Jonathan.
Yeah. So, you know, as I listened to you, I was really, I mean, it's like the third or fourth time I've seen you speak, and I always like the viewpoint you take. And what really struck me this time was that you were doing what I would call a phenomenological reduction. And that's a philosophical technique where you keep looking at what it is you are looking at and trying to figure out more about it. And getting to conclusions where you talk about science and religion. Phenomenology to me is beyond science and religion. All the great religions that you talked about, they're very young in terms of humankind's existence on the planet. Very young. It's almost as young as our writing. The fact that we actually were able to write. That's how young it is. And so the thinking, to me, around the time that you and I were dealing with corporations and the legal structure, I kept looking back, how did corporations come to be? And I was very happy to see, David Corton's book on the issues and so on. And when I went back and back and back, and I got to human prehistory. And human prehistory is 200,000 years old. They must have had some sort of communication, but they were very much in nature. Get up in the morning, and there's your kitchen. Your animals that you could kill, the food you could pick and so on, and the groups that you could, activities that could go and trap and so on, these animals. And it's what we've lost is that connection to our nature, as you're talking about. And so our religion is something that we've adopted because we just don't know what happened way, way back when. And I thought that that means that you talk about the values, the economy is based on money, but the money that we have, when I spend money on something like therapy, for example, and I say, oh, she costs $180 an hour or $190, I'm really saying, am I worth that much?
Jonathan, I'm going to want you to wrap it up so we get other people.
So the reason I'm talking about this is because I would urge that we do this work of phenomenology deeper and keep going deeper into what it is how we're really being affected, because the power of belief is the last thing I'll say. The power of belief has really affected us all deeply. And that's what's holding us back, is that because we don't understand what that is. I think belief is related to emotion and fear. And the more we can create a gentle and comforting society, that's what I would ask you, is how do we do that? How do we create that kind of a comforting, supportive society? And in the face of all the stuff that we're faced with right now.
And I'm going to ask you to be succinct, Andrew, so that we can get other people's questions in.
Yeah, well, first, a few thoughts, and being succinct is not one of my gifts, but I'll do my best, George, I promise. First of all, Edmund Husserl is a great example of a great mathematician who, unlike his Enlightenment forebears, said math can't do it. So phenomenology is based on eidetic imagination, as you say, John. eidetic imagination is what Husserl came up with. I cannot mathematize a leaf. I can't even mathematize. I don't have any tools. So I need to understand a leaf through eidetic imagination. So, phenomenology is almost the opposite of the bad science. It's actually great. I'm a huge fan of phenomenology, and Husserl especially. So he got it, so A, with that. B, yeah, corporations, and of course, David's great book. But I would also think that we should think about Christianity and the idea of making everyone part of the corporate body of Christ. That is, when you take communion in the Catholic Church, you become part of in him, with him, through him. You become in the corporate body of Christ. So that's rather chilling when you think of how corporations have taken over and embedded everything within in the corporate body, including nature and our own human nature, treating us as cogs in its wheel. So I would see again another train from the corporation as understood, the corporate body of Christ, incorporated corporeal body of Christ to the corporation. I'm not saying it doesn't go back into other things. Finally, I'll try to be succinct. I recommend Jacques Ellul on this. I don't know how many people here have read Jacques Ellul, a great teacher of mine. I mean, I didn't know him, but read him a lot. And he said that there were 3 stages of man. You have the nature, which you were talking about, Jonathan. The nature, when we primarily in our milieu, which is the word he used, is nature. From that, after the agricultural age, we became into the historical age, where our milieu was each other. And that's when you get Shakespeare, you get all this interacting of the human with human. We're alienated from nature now a little bit. We're using nature to support societies, governments, things like democracies, rights, revolutions, and all that. And then Ellul makes the step in the technological system and the technological society that we then move from there to the technological milieu. So we're no longer, we think of ourselves in these churches that we're talking about, think of themselves, they're still in this social, don't do this, no adultery, no murder, but we've moved way past that. What Ellul says that we are in the technological milieu, which both expropriates nature, expropriates our human nature, but for the service of the technological world beyond our tech. So our lives are now mediated, our telephones, TV, what we're doing right now, everything we're doing is being mediated by technology. And a technology which we use so much it becomes unconscious. So those are the 3 stages. And of course, each one not only supersedes the one before it, it expropriates it. So we are now expropriating the natural world and human nature in the service of a technological system, a technological society. Brilliant, I think, analysis by Jacques Ellul. I recommend it. That's as succinct as I can be. Sorry, Georgia.
Okay, and I was trying to, I can't remember how to spell Ellul's last name, so I kind of.
E-L-L-U-L.
Oh, I did that.
E-L-L-U-L.
That's exactly the way I did it. I put it in the chat box. So David Corton, you're next.
Yeah. Oh, before I start, Katie, your image keeps jumping back and forth. It's very distracting. I don't know what's going on. But
Whose image, David?
pardon?
Whose image?
Katie's.
I will stop her video. Thank
Also, David, you can direct it to only show who's speaking, so you don't see everyone while someone's speaking. That's also a solution on your ends that I can teach you how to do later.
But no, I know how to do that. I like to see everybody.
Gotcha.
Anyhow, so Andrew, you've spoken at great length about the conceptual aspects of how we got into this crisis. Now you've mentioned some books that you recommend we read, but I'd really like to hear you go deeper into your own thinking about what the lessons are of the things that you have been spelling out to us in such depth. What does that tell us about what we need to do now and how we go about shifting the consciousness or the story of contemporary society so that we can move on to an ecological society, or what some of us are calling an ecological civilization, but it's essentially the same thing?
Yeah. Well, I think everybody on this call can answer that question in various ways. I'll give it just a quick shot at it, which is that we need to continue to stop the bleeding. This is in no way, and I mentioned this last time, we need to have that litigation. We need to pass those laws. We need to try and stop the next pesticide. We need to stop, we need to develop renewable energy sources. We need to stop the bleeding. because if we don't stop the bleeding, well, there won't be time to change the consciousness. So there's a double job we all have. Stop the bleeding, file those lawsuits, support those organizations, do whatever you can. If that's your gift, do it. But again, unless we change the consciousness, there's never going to be enough of us to stop that bleeding. So what I'm attempting to do with this in my, I do it rather simplistically because that's how I kind of, and paradigmatically, because that's sort of my gift, if I have a gift. And that's what I'm saying. You look at certain things like the age of extraction, you realize it's over, it's doomed. It's not, we can't live in that. It's not as if we're fighting the age of extraction and it's going to be here 200 years from now. It's not.
But what's
right?
the alternative?
Well, the alternative is to have.
I mean, I can give you my view of an alternative, but this is not my presentation. This is your presentation.
It sure is. And I've said it, the paradigm shift has to go from extraction to regeneration. And it's happening around the world. People are doing it. Regenerative agriculture, regenerative medicine. That's not theoretical, David. Those are happening. People, this is the regeneration is just taking off in so many areas. It's very exciting, very exciting. The same with the doomed idea that we can exterminate those parts of nature we don't like, including exterminate indigenous people, by the way, but also exterminate the weeds that don't fit our industrial system. Agroecology is taking off. The food movement is taking off. Attack on antibiotics, people use antibiotics through probiotics. These are movements that are happening. This is not theoretical, David. These are actual solutions that are happening in the real world right now. They just need to be understood. And this is what I said last time. All these things need to be understood as part of one struggle towards the ecological civilization. Right now, they're being fought in an isolated way. People are going through regeneration. Other people doing agriculture. We're seeing much greater participatory ecological education. We're seeing new things. Is capitalism done? Is the market system over? And the contradictions of that. So we're seeing eco-psychology, eco-spirituality growing all the time. So these things are real. These alternatives to these dead zombie paradigms, because there's no future for the industrial paradigms. But they're zombies. They're still eating our brains and killing the earth and ourselves. So these things that I'm talking about are actually happening. It's not some, pie in the sky idea. And I'm working on them myself, as in many of these areas, not all, but many of them. And we're working to fight corporate power. And we're working to expose the myth of panacea technologies. And we're working to break digital addiction. And we're working to expose the military surveillance thing. So all this is happening. It's just not united in a narrative, David. That to me is the problem. It isn't that the alternatives.
Yeah, well, what's the narrative? What's the narrative? I want to know how I use what you spent an hour laying out for us.
Yeah.
Can I just interject a minute here, because I think what Richard Heinberg mentioned in his talk is something that you're leading to talking about too, Andrew, and that is we need an anti-collapse coalition. That's what he called it. And I thought, we do need a coalition like that understands the need to regenerate. And we don't have that. So I don't know if you want to say anything further on that. I do want to go to other questions also.
Yeah, I just want to, people haven't listened to my first talk.
Right.
I mentioned the importance of Karl Polanyi, and I want to just reemphasize now, the narrative to me has a lot to do with Karl Polanyi, has a lot to do with the idea that we need to say the problem with capitalism and industrial capitalism, the industrial market system, is not that it went wrong or that it could be improved. All those are true. But the problem was from the very beginning of treating land, humans, and money as commodities subject to supply and demand. That was disastrous. That wasn't a premise. That was a premise. And we've been fighting ever since, as Polanyi points out, to try and buffer that system from its own nightmares of child labor, destruction of nature, huge ups and downs in economic depressions, inflations. We've been fighting this contradiction of the system, which was unethical and diseased from the beginning, from Francis Hutchinson and Adam Smith. It created a lot of wealth, but it was a false premise. It was a Midas touch. It turned everything into gold, and then by doing that, it destroyed the value of it. The Midas myth is a perfect myth and the only difference with me and Polanyi is that Polanyi saw the New Deal and the Great Society, and he at the very end, and he said, maybe that'll work. You didn't imagine Thatcher and Reaganism. So that's the narrative. We have to be honest and say this system was never, it was unethical, and the damage that it's done since then was virtually inevitable, and you can never buffer it enough. So that's, to me, Polanyi is really important here. Karl Polanyi, if you haven't read The Great Transformation, I really, first of all, he's a good writer. I recommend it. It really, for me, is far more important than Marx, as far as really understanding the double movement that we've seen between the growth of capitalism and then the need for all the bureaucracy, all the agencies, everything that we're trying to do to buffer it from destroying, and those were not enough. So it's going to collapse. So that's the narrative, that we've been living in a false world, in a dream world. Alienated from nature, disembedded from nature, disembedded from human nature, disembedded from the realities. And we've been in this dream world is turning into a nightmare. So that's, you want a narrative? That's my narrative.
Well, we read Polanyi in our book club and had a lot of discussion about it. And one of the things you said that's just attached to what you were saying now is that the regulations and the legislature, the laws that we put into place are important because they're stopping the bleeding, but they're inadequate in that they are not really taking on the deeper problems. So
let me just jump on that, Georgia, for a second, which is, I'm an environmental lawyer. I litigate under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, right? And that's good. We do good, important work on that. But what people are doing should be criminal. To continue selling and making billions of dollars and getting 20 billion of our taxpayer dollars, for the fossil fuel industry, that's criminal.
Yeah.
Getting a pesticide that's destroying bees, that should be a crime.
Yeah.
Mountaintop removal, that should be a crime. It shouldn't be something I litigate. Oh, that you violated the Clean Air Act and EPA, you let them do it. And this is long procedural stuff. And I've won many battles, including Supreme Court battle on climate change. But what's happened since I won that Supreme Court battle? Almost nothing. So that's why I'm introducing these ideas of terracide, ecocide, and biocide. We should begin to think of these as, and by the way, the killing of the earth, which is terracide, is the greatest crime. Because and then lesser crimes, but horrible enough, for ecocides, the destruction of an ecosystem like mountaintop removal or wetland destruction, and then destroying biodiversity through pesticides, through deforestation. That's biocide. They should be crimes. And if yes, we can put that into criminal code and see how far that gets, but we should also have a change of consciousness and begin talking. Sierra Club, the top 10, NRDC, they need to start talking about this in criminal terms to change that consciousness. Because right now they're getting away with it.
That's a conversation we need to have separately from this. I'd love to have that with you, Andrew, and maybe some other people on this call would like to. It looks like Linda, you're next. And we're going to have to end soon. So Linda?
Well, yeah, that was really my question. You were beginning to answer it before we went over to Jonathan. I mean, how do you change consciousness quickly? I'm in the consciousness change, industry myself with Bohemian dialogue, but how do you do that quickly? It's not a fast changing process.
You only need a critical mass.
Yeah, well, one of the things is that it's going to happen. It's happening to us, right? So if you want to talk about antibiotics and pesticides as a war against ourselves, well, people are realizing that now, and they realize millions of people are having bacterial infections that cannot be treated because of the overuse of antibiotics in animal factories. We're seeing the climate crisis. We're seeing the fires. We're seeing the hurricanes. We're seeing whole areas disrupted. It's now becoming climate chaos. Climate change became climate crisis, and now it's climate chaos. We can't avoid that. Wherever you live, it's happening to you. They're saying there's going to be, so these things are, the emergency, the long emergency is getting more and more dire. So that's going to feed into the consciousness changes, Linda. That's unfortunately, that's food for us. That actually helps us, saying, see,
I agree that that's helpful, but I don't see the people who are blocking it, who are distracting it, which are the fossil fuel, the people at the top of the hierarchy that are blocking us, that are distracting us. I don't see how we can move through this fast enough. I mean, I agree with everything you say. I just don't know what the fastest path to consciousness changing is.
Well, yeah, I have a small therapeutic practice, where I do life counseling and dream analysis, because my background is young and dynamic, and from, and of course in Winnicott, and I always have 4 or 5 people that I work with, again, combination of dream analysis, because sometimes I think the best way to work, actually to change consciousness is working to help people save their souls one at a time. It's the only way I know to do it in a comprehensive way. But in my last conversation, I said, I'm not optimistic. It would be silly if I'm not going to get here and be optimistic in front of you brilliant people. I'm going to say I am hopeful though. And one of the things that gives me hope is just what I was telling, David Corton, these things are happening. They just haven't been united. It's not, and there's no future in the other ones. We don't have the soil for their agriculture. We don't have the seeds for we don't have, the farmers. These are dead paradigms and they're going to wind their way down. The question is, they're zombie. Can we stop them in time? And all these movements are happening. They're just not united in understanding that this is one movement together away from the industrial world into the ecological civilization or society, that we're in that movement and that we're all together on that. Instead, they're all being fought separately. So my biggest job to attempt to do is to bring that together, to bring these movements together and to try and have them realize that our power is in our synergy.
And that's where I think Richard Heinberg is right. We have to develop what he calls horizontal power. We have to unite the various people who are all working, but we have to realize it's one major front.
Yeah, Richard's always right. So that's always a safe statement. Hey, Richard's right. He's one of my favorite people. And by the way, an excellent musician, excellent violinist in his own right, may I say.
Yes, he is. He is.
He's a fabulous violinist.
I think the temptation for reformism in groups that are getting lots of corporate support and groups that don't want to, become heretics is strong. So our enemy is not so much, for me, the bad guys. We know who they are. We know what they're, and I'm not saying bad personally. I may be a worse person than they are.
Guys.
Yeah, but our problem is reformism. Our problem is to say the real answer is just to reform, tweak it here, make that bill better, do something with climate crisis, as if that was going to solve the problem. So the reformists among us, and God bless them, we need some of that to stop the bleeding. But unless we can transform that into a transformational systemic change in the way that we're all talking about, the reformists, in a way, in our movement are some of our most difficult hurdles.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go to Ben. I'm going to ask, I have two more questions, Ben and John, and I would like you to be succinct if you can, and we will then complete the program. So Ben, you're next.
Yeah, I've been really impressed with Andrew's, the direction of this talk. I wasn't sure where this was going to go, but I have been saying for many years that to develop the kind of transformational energy required for really what amounts to a planetary mobilization to deal with the crises of the 21st century, that it's going to take some kind of quasi-religious movement. And I kind of see the elements of it in this kind of Gaia consciousness that people are developing. I would say that, there's lessons to be taken from what I regard as the first major attempt to create a secular, quasi-religious transformative ideology, which was Marxism. And that was the remedy for the industrial age. And, we can still learn the basic dynamics of capitalism from that. But one of the core concepts of Marx was that class consciousness was when a class became aware of itself as a class. He said it very elegantly, and I can't remember it exactly. And I think that in the next iteration of this ideology, a kind of a more Teilhard de Chardinian version of it, we need to develop a species consciousness so that when that happens, when the species as a whole awakens to the fact that it is a species, and we act and plan and direct our political actions accordingly. So I feel like it's going to take more than just this cold technocratic approach. It's got to have something with heart more importantly, that gives people a career path. And I think we should start thinking seriously about how do we start creating opportunities for young people to not just get inspired, but make a living doing something that is socially valuable, socially productive. I would bend a lot of policy toward making sure that it's not just the tech fix, but also the social fix.
Okay.
Both of those got to happen.
Yeah, I think that one of the great crimes of this system is the idea of jobs. You know, the old idea of job came from the word steal, con job, bank job. And the great enclosure movement, which I talked about in my last, we don't have time to go over, I talked about in my last conversation. They took people of there, and this is happening all around the world. They take people off the land, and they use the land for export crops, which gives big money to the powers that be. And those people end up in Bhopal, Addis Ababa, Mexico City, in these tent cities, because they've been kicked off the land, no longer being used for subsistence, but I don't really like that word, but for independent farming. And now they're, you know, making 5 cents an hour, and we supposedly got them out of poverty. That is for kids today to be brought up and think of jobs and careers, which comes from the word careening. And they use that in London in the early days. People are careening. That's the word career comes from. Versus thinking of, and it's so hard for young people. I am so compassionate for this. I'm not a judgment here at all, but to think of your life as a vocation, as a vocatio, as a calling. And then that would become a profession, as in a profession of faith. If you can begin to think of your life and get young people to think of their life, wait for your calling, think about it, meditate on it. And then once that happens, and this happens, a good therapist does this, I think too, then they begin to profess what they believe. And that profession, that's what profession should be, a profession of faith. And I agree with you. There has to be, if the transcendental function is there, and I believe it is, I think Fromm and Jung are right. I wouldn't contradict them any more than I'd contradict Richard Heimberg. Then we're going to have to get some of that in there. And I think that one of the things is that it's anti-human. Efficiency, I said, but if you try to use efficiency or quantitative thinking or competition as the basis for your relationship with your children, your friends, your pets, the natural world, it is cold and terrible. No human being can do it. So it turns us all into schizophrenics. The society is based on these inhuman things, and we yearn for the warmth. We yearn for the love. We yearn for the empathy. We yearn for that. And in that yearning, we get hopefully the expansion of our empathy, the expansion of the circle of our empathy to include the earth and the community of earth, and not just, yes, we have to define ourselves, as Thomas Berry said, at the species level. But in doing so, it's with empathy, it's with love, and also with our survival and that in mind. So there's a huge opportunity here for spiritual, psychological, emotional growth that has been cut off and turned into a shadow by this civil cold religion trinity that I was talking about. And I agree with you, that has to be part of the deal.
This jobs idea versus vocation is really important understanding and differentiation, because one is you are in love with what you do, and the other is you're just a cog in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, let's get E.F. Schumacher another kudo, which he always deserves. His book, Good Work.
Yes.
Was the one that first gave me this idea that I said. I then wrote for Utney Reader and wrote a bunch of articles on contrasting the job career with the calling vocatio profession. Yeah.
Right. Very important distinctions. I'm going to go to the last question, which will be John. John, are you there?
Yeah. Hello. Great broad speech. I just wanted to ask a little more clarity on the technological. I'm 25, so I haven't, lived in a world without the internet and social media and all that stuff. So I am what you might call, I'm a computer scientist. I'm what you might call a technical evangelical. At least, before I heard all of this stuff in praxis about panacea technologies and whatnot. I just wanted to ask, is there a symbiotic relationship that's possible with technology and science? Because you describe it pretty, as ubiquitously cold and I've always felt like tech is much more agnostic than you're describing it. So is it an issue of culture and culture informing capitalistic use of technology? Is the paradigm of looking for technology the issue? I don't understand where the issue is with science and technology. Is it the method itself? Is it, how we use it? Is it the cultural surroundings of that drove us to it? Is it possible to have a symbiotic relationship with technology in an ecological world?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And maybe I didn't emphasize this enough. The problem comes when we capital S science, capital T technology, capital M the market, right? In other words, science is one way to get to certain kinds of truth and very valuable truth, right? I want to know, if I'm short on vitamin D, I want those scientific tests if I'm sick. Science is good. A lot of great things come from science, right? But it's when science becomes capitalist science and it becomes omniscient, where we believe all truths come from science. That makes it very dangerous, because it means we then constrict our world to quantitative reality, and we devalue the qualitative. So science is fine in its place, but it doesn't like its place. It wants to be a god, and it wants to usurp all other aspects of it. And if you don't think that's true, read a lot more science stuff. Believe me, it is true. And by the way, our media treats it that way as well. And technologies, I love the piano. There's many wonderful technologies, my goodness. But when technology becomes the salvation, when technology is viewed as this is what's going to save us from climate crisis, from all disease, from all mental illness, from any human thing, and the limits of nature, we're going to have silicon bodies, and we're going to colonize the planets, and that will defeat death. And we don't have to worry about the earth, because when this kind of use of technology as God, as a God form that's going to save us from everything, then it becomes very dangerous, right? And because then there's no limits. And the market the same way. If the market is seen as even more important than any laws of nature, when supply and demand and competition and the market system is viewed as the answer, the truth, and where ecological reality is put aside, then the market becomes its own God. So that's the importance of it. Not that the market doesn't have a place in any economic system. Not that we don't have wonderful uses. We're homo faber. We love to make things, and science has its role. It's when they are elevated to ex cathedra, to take the place of monotheisms that are dying. That's when we get that problem. That's when it comes in. Is that any clearer, John, at all?
It is to me, and
Yeah, absolutely. I was just a little stuck on the distinction between big S science and big S scientists. The difference between the people screwing things up ideologically and the ideas themselves. But
Right.
yes,
I think many scientists fall into it because it's very inflating to think that I'm the person that's doing the only way to get truth. That's a difficult inflation to resist. If I was a scientist, and if I'm an engineer of technology, I'm going to say I'm going to use this geoengineering to save the world from the climate crisis. That's very inflating. That sounds good to me. Or I'm an economist. Through the market system is going to, if we can just commodify and have credits for carbon pollution and trade them among companies and do this to the market and that in the market and this to the market, that's going to solve it. These are very, which is pretty much what Gates is trying to do in the Davos crowd, which we talked about last time. That's very inflating. It's a new religion, and it can be very inflationary, and they will stick to it. Many of not all by any means, but many of the practitioners will stick to that. And we know we have that in Silicon Valley, a lot of that going on.
the technological gods.
Yeah, they really are. And think of meta, and think what's going on with the whole idea of a meta universe. If that isn't hubristic, and that isn't inflationary, and that isn't the view of technology as creating a whole new reality, I don't know what is, folks, that they change it to the word meta as in metaphysics, by the way, first. Yeah.
Well, that's a lovely note to end on. But as you say, you're not an optimist, but you're hopeful because of all the things that are going on.
And let me repeat that for all of us, this is a long struggle. I'm standing on the shoulders of some of you, and also many others that we've talked about. Jacques Ellul, by the way, the technological system, I think, is better than the technological society. I saw that come over, on chat. We don't know the success of this. Linda and others, we don't know. But what I do know is that for the time I have left on this particular plane, I can be faithful. I can keep telling my truth, saying what I came to say, and working with people such as you and all of us, and becoming more synergistic with one another, like Richard was talking, Heimberg, and that has to be enough. One has to be at peace with that, because torturing oneself that I'm not being heard, or not enough people are listening, or this and this, that's not really going to get us too far. So it seems to me, we're not required to be successful. We're required to be faithful in what we do and move forward, and with one another. And again, to answer David's question one more time, I get the luxury of traveling around the world and meeting with people who are creating this new ecological future, people of great spirit, great emotion, great skill. So it's out there. It just needs to be organized better. It needs this larger narrative that we've been talking about. And that, thank you, Georgia, for you being some of the proponent who's spreading that narrative and many narratives that are related to it out into the world.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This is one of our longest sessions, but there's so much to digest and think about and talk about that I actually will want people to watch it and maybe have a separate discussion about the things that came up today. As usual, you are brilliant, and it's just exciting to hear you and to hear the ideas that you bring forth. And there's always something new. It's not a repeat, which is.
Well, Georgia, we didn't even get to music. Next time.
I know we never even got to music.
Next time, because I've got this whole thing about music and nature, which we got to get into sometime.
Okay, next time we're going to start with it. That's going to be the
Start
topic.
with it. Yeah, and here's my teaser. All of nature is non-identical repetition. This gets into Jonathan's phenomenology, or it wasn't Jonathan, phenomenology. Maybe it was Jonathan on Husserl and phenomenology. All of nature is non-identical repetition. If that doesn't remind you of theme and variations, the sonata form, and on music, so that just begins the opening up of this incredible wisdom that music can give us.
Okay, and
About
that's
everything we're talking about today.
and Jonathan will be very interested in that discussion as well.
Mhm.